Welcome, everyone, to the On Poly podcast. I'm Steve Paikin.
And I'm John Michael McGrath.
Today on the pod, a school field trip in the capital city takes a disturbing turn, and now the Ministry of Education is investigating.
Premier Ford is telling homeless people to get off their butts and work, and he's taking heat for it.
Meanwhile, the Premier wants to build a tunnel under the 401 and insists he can get it done.
And a special guest joins us this week. It's Liberal leader Bonnie Crombie.
Speaking of which, in your column, my column, I'll focus on the Liberals' new slogan, which seems to offer a significant break from slogans of the past.
And I'll talk about a scary warning about the housing crisis. It might even get worse in the next few years.
Yikes. It is Friday, September 27th, 2024, so let's get to it. Partner, want to give me some sugar?
Good
there
to
we
see
go.
you.
Very briefly off the top, because we got a packed show, I'm wearing this shirt today because this week, 30 years ago, TVO signed on with its first ever nightly current affairs program. It was called Studio 2. I was one of the hosts. Mary Hines was the other host. And we had a 30th anniversary reunion, chez moi, this past weekend. And I'm just reveling in the memory of it all.
Congratulations.
Thank you. So there we go. Now, let's get back to business here. We all remember taking memorable school field trips as kids, right? Well, a field trip for a school in Toronto took a very controversial turn recently. The class was supposed to be watching a protest by supporters of the Grassy Narrows First Nation as they try to seek justice from the province. Instead, they found themselves in the middle of a pro-Palestinian protest, a somewhat different experience, and now the Ministry of Education wants an investigation.
Right. So, the idea of school groups going to watch protests happen is not novel. It's not particularly controversial. The experience of seeing a protest as a fundamental act of democracy in our society, I think that's something you could reasonably make part of the education system. The issue here seems to be that there are a few issues, one of which is that students were asked to wear blue shirts, and they took part in chants that included some anti-Israel slogans. The color blue was meant to signify water, right? We're talking about Grassy Narrows, a First Nation whose water supply has been polluted by Ontario industry. But it also identified non-Indigenous children as settlers, and that obviously has, particularly in the context of anti-Israeli slogans being chanted, it got very, very badly mixed up. I don't think you have to be too imaginative or speculative to see how Jewish students in particular might have felt that they were being shoehorned into a pro-Palestinian demonstration against their will, or frankly, it's not exclusive to Jewish families. Anybody might be offended by some of the language that was heard, and so obviously a problematic instance.
And you can imagine if the shoe were on the other foot, if some young Palestinian kids from a school suddenly found themselves in the middle of a pro-Israeli protest, I don't think people would love that anymore.
No.
So this is problematic. There's a political angle on this as well. Rachel Chernos-Lynn is the chair of the Toronto District School Board. She is also a candidate running for office right now in a Toronto City Council by-election. So how this incident might affect her plans to win that by-election, we can't know, but you can imagine.
Yes, and we should also mention, the reason this is on the On Poly podcast is because the Education Minister, Jill Dunlop, has gotten wind of this and has ordered an investigation of this. So clearly, it's not just a matter of local education policy in the Toronto District School Board. The provincial government would like to know how something like this can happen in a very heavily provincially funded education system as well. You mentioned this municipal by-election. That takes place on November 4th, so still a bit of time to see how this will all percolate through local politics.
Indeed. And with that, we're on to issue 2. Anyone who spent any time walking the downtowns of cities and towns all over Ontario knows we have a major homelessness problem in which addiction and mental health issues play a huge role. So, it was with considerable interest that some people seized on a comment made by Doug Ford at a news conference in Cobourg earlier this week. Here's what the Premier had to say about homeless people living in encampments.
Do you know what the best way to get people be able to get out of the encampments, get out of homeless? Get an application and drop it off one of these companies and start working. You need to start working if you're healthy. Bottom line, if you're unhealthy, I'll take care of you the rest of my life. Your life will take care of you. But if you're healthy, get off your ASS and start working like everyone else is. Very simple.
What's the issue here as far as you're concerned?
Well, we talked about Northumberland County and Cobourg in last week's episode. There is an encampment in provincial lands that is a local issue in Cobourg, and you mentioned this off the top, right? This issue of homelessness, what these local communities are experiencing, is happening in cities and towns around the province. Housing costs are up. Good jobs are in short supply. ODSP and OW, the two major provincial income supports, just don't really go very far and impose lots of conditions on people who want to access them. The Premier likes to boast about the province's job creation, but the numbers do tell at least something of a different tale. The unemployment rate in Ontario is currently 7.1%, which is higher than the day he took office in 2018. So it is not, in fact, as simple for a lot of people as just putting in an application.
Well, and speaking of simple, it's not that simple if you're suffering from addiction and mental health issues and you're homeless and all of your worldly goods are in a shopping cart and you're living in some public square. It's not that simple, actually, to apply for a job. You need a home address on a resume. A lot of these people don't have home addresses. Maybe none of them do. You need to apply online sometimes. I suspect a lot of these folks don't have laptops like we're working off of right now as they do that. This is all while you're essentially trying to survive through another day. It's a little tough.
No, absolutely. And, if this were just a matter of people getting off of their butts, I will keep our language clean, people would not be experiencing these issues if it were that simple. There are systemic issues. There have been for a long time in Ontario that make it hard for people to find jobs where they need them. And also, even if they're able to find jobs, there are people who are, they refer, this is not so much an issue with encampments, but we do also have a problem of the so-called hidden homeless, of people who have jobs but can't afford shelter, and they're living out of cars, or they are couch surfing with friends and family whenever they can. So it is more complex.
Well, and I don't mean to be a jerk by asking this question. Has the Premier of Ontario ever been to a homeless encampment? I suspect he has not. I certainly have as part of this job, and I well remember meeting a woman in Hamilton many months ago. We talked about it right here on the podcast, who was living in a tent at City Hall Square in the city of Hamilton. I went over and talked to her. I said, what percentage of people living here have addiction or mental health issues? She said about 99.9%. So this isn't a question for those people about getting off your ASS to get a job. These people are not healthy. And I'll give the Premier his due when he said, if you're unhealthy, we'll take care of you for the rest of your life. But if you're healthy, you need to get off your ASS and go get a job. The reality is all of these people, virtually all of these people are unhealthy. They don't have decent clothes to show up for a job interview. They don't have the other accoutrements you need to show up to a job interview and make a good impression. So there may be here a disconnect between the Premier's understanding of who is in these encampments and who's really in these encampments.
Yeah, no, and I have said this before on the podcast, so I will not belabor the point. I'll just say very briefly, I mean, there is a connection between drug use and homelessness, but I don't think it's simple, and I don't think it's purely one way. The places with the worst drug use are not actually generally the places with the worst homelessness problems. Homelessness is a housing problem, and so long as we have a housing crisis in this province, we are going to continue to have a homelessness problem.
Right on. And with that, we're on to issue 3. Premier Ford sees himself as a visionary city builder, and earlier this week he put forward more evidence as to why. With a bumper-to-bumper Highway 401 in the background, Ford announced he wants to investigate building a tunnel under Canada's biggest highway, from Peel Region in the west to Scarborough in the east. Now, the reaction to that was, shall we say, mixed. Here is official opposition NDP leader Marit Stiles with her reaction to the plan.
Come on. I've reached my limit on this. This is a fantasy tunnel when we need real, solid solutions for a serious issue.
I'm not marking her down as undecided on this one. That sounded like a firm no to me.
Pretty clear, yes.
Yeah. So what would this involve?
Well, it's difficult to say in detail because we don't really have, it's not like we even have even so much as a line on a map. But we can speak in generalities here. This would be a huge undertaking. When the Premier says, for example, that he would do a tunnel from Peel to Scarborough, just for argument's sake, I'm taking this as something like from Pearson Airport in the west to Kingston Road in the east. That would be about 45 kilometers of tunnel, about double the length of the world's longest road tunnel currently.
Now, usually you ask for a feasibility study if you are undecided on something.
Yes.
You say, let's look into this. And if there's a good case for doing it, we'll do it. But if there isn't, we won't do it. The Premier did not say that at his press conference. He said, this thing is going to get built. We are going to get it done.
Yeah, I mean, my concern there is that he more or less just told every civil engineering company in Canada that money is no object. What's the bidding process going to look like here, really?
Well, and he did not offer any cost estimates or even ballpark figures as to what this might cost, just as he has not for Highway 413, which is also in the process of being built. But this is not completely unprecedented. There are other attempts to build either underwater or underground tunnels elsewhere, so we have an idea about cost. What do you think?
Well, so that Norwegian tunnel that I mentioned, the world's longest, cost something like $1 billion US when it was finished about a generation ago, if I have my numbers right. But for a bunch of reasons that are too long to get into here, English-speaking countries don't tend to build as efficiently as others. So if we take an Anglophone comparison, the WestConnex project in Sydney, Australia, will be about 35 kilometers of highways when it is complete, mostly underground. The initial estimate was that it would cost $10 billion. New, more recent estimates suggest that could be as much as $45 billion now. And unlike what the Premier has assured voters, that this tunnel will not be tolled, the WestConnex project will be tolled. I think that's important here because, there's at least the prospect of making some of that money back from user charges and helping defray the cost. As presented by the Premier this week, this tunnel would be paid for purely out of tax revenue.
Now, I note the three opposition leaders at Queen's Park don't necessarily agree with each other on everything or get along much. They're as competitive with each other as they are with the government of the day. But Mart Stiles, opposition leader, Bonnie Crombie, Liberal leader, Mike Schreiner, Green leader, all say, why would you undertake a project of this magnitude, which will, even if you were to do it, and even if you could afford it, which will create havoc and chaos for 20 years while you do it, why would you do that rather than just pluck a simpler solution out of the air, which is to say, get all the trucks off the 401, let them ride for free on the 407, maybe widen the 407, maybe repatriate the 407. We owned it, we sold it, maybe buy it back. I don't know.
Well, to that point, I mean, if this were to get into the 30, 35, $40 billion range for a tunnel of this magnitude, and I think somebody needs to convince me that's not at least on the table. I think that's a very plausible range of costs.
More, way more.
The 407, it's difficult to say what the cost of buying back the 407 would be, but some of the hints we have is that it could be in the $30 to $35 billion range. Now, it already exists. We don't have to talk about construction chaos. We don't have to talk about cost overruns. Buying it back would be relatively straightforward. So again, if the cost of this kind of a project starts to get into that $30 billion range, buying back the 407 starts to look very, very attractive as an alternative.
But the Premier has kickstarted a fascinating debate about how we want to spend our money and what we want to spend it on, and I'm sure that debate will take place for years and years to come. And as we just did, speaking of the Ontario Liberals, here comes their leader. The Ontario Liberals held their annual general meeting in London last weekend. The party has a new logo and a new slogan for its new leader. So joining us now is that new leader, Bonnie Crombie. Great to have you with us here at our On Poly table.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Over to you, JMM.
Sure. So you just had your annual general meeting. What, in your view, was the most important thing to emerge from the conference this past weekend?
The unity, the excitement, the energy, the momentum. And I think Steve will know this number very well, but it's been 14 years since Liberals have had a policy convention. So my commitment during leadership was that we would have not only our AGM, but a policy conference. And we did that very successfully. We had, as you well know, over 1,000 people at our conference this weekend. A lot of excitement. It was like a big homecoming. And I think coming out of leadership last year, people were really excited to gather together again. And we had, of course, a lot of great speakers, and I can tell you about some of those, and I'm sure you're going to ask about them, so I won't preempt you.
I did not know about the 14 years, so okay, thank you for putting that on the record. I wanted to follow up on John Michael's question with a question about your new slogan. which is more for you. What are you
Yes.
trying to evoke with that slogan?
Well, as you well know, I feel very strongly that Doug Ford has failed Ontarians, and he's more focused on his rich friends, cronies, cozy insiders, than the families and the people of Ontario. So this is a signal that we are going to focus less on them and focus more on you, the families of Ontario. So it's not the singular you, it's the all-encompassing Ontarians, you, all of us.
Okay, that's interesting because I actually wrote a column about this
I
past week.
saw that. And
You
I thought,
did?
Of course I did.
Oh, okay. Well, because, and the feedback I got to that column from a lot of people was, this doesn't exactly sound like JFK's ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. They thought it was more a clarion call to self-interest as opposed to
No,
what
not
we
at
can do
all.
together. So-
Yeah, no, not at all. I mean, certainly it is about Ontarians, and that's really the focus because there are people who are getting ahead today while everyone else is facing affordability crises, can't find a home to buy, can't afford rent. There are families who aren't buying meat at the grocery store, taking items out, making dollars stretch. People are facing long wait times in hospital hallways. Seniors are getting moved to long-term care facilities far away. And we see crowded classrooms and schools not being repaired. So there are people getting ahead in this movement towards privatization, whether it's our healthcare or our education system. And there are special interest groups that are certainly benefiting, but we feel that Ontario families are not. So this is speaking to them, and this slogan, new slogan if you call it, will evolve so we can better explain it. It was just the launch, and it's centered around my remarks, which I don't know if you caught this weekend or not.
Yes.
Certainly. So, less for all of them who are benefiting today, but more for average Ontarians and the families of Ontario who are not getting ahead and who are really struggling. And I hear that from people on the street all the time. People will stop me in the grocery store, in the pharmacy, in the Winners and the Home Sense, where I like to shop, and speak to me about what they're facing, the challenges they're facing. And that happened while I was the mayor and before that, the councillor in Mississauga. And I'm very approachable, so people come up to me and they tell me their experiences in their lives and how they're struggling and how their autistic child has waited 8 years for a diagnosis. So they aren't even eligible for treatment, haven't been eligible. And of course, we know that early intervention is what works, and that's not what's been happening. So this is a signal to Ontarians and to Ontario families that this is about them now. We're going to focus on them.
You are not the leader of the official opposition. The New Democrats are the official opposition at Queen's Park. The Liberals are not an officially recognized party. You haven't hit that 12-seat threshold yet, and yet. The Premier is constantly attacking you. Social media, the government's various ad campaigns are about you or about the Liberals. Barely ever mentions the NDP or Marit Stiles. Any idea as to why that is?
I say Robert Benzie coined a phrase, and he said that I live rent-free in his head. I think he's trying to distract Ontarians from their key priorities that are facing them today, the key challenges as I described, the healthcare challenges, long waits to get into hospital admission, hallway medicine, large classroom sizes, the lack of special education teachers. So he's trying to put the focus on me rather than himself and his own failures. And for whatever reason, we butt heads a couple times while I was mayor of the city of Mississauga and while I was chair of the big city mayors. And I'm a very forward and forthright person. Everyone knows where they stand with me. So I call it out when I see it.
You told a story at the convention, actually, where when you were the mayor, he approached you and said, "Why don't you ever say nice things about me?"
Yes, he's.
So why don't you ever say nice things?
He doesn't take criticism. It's constructive criticism, I felt usually. How he was gouging municipalities with his many changes to his housing bills. Frankly, I remember the one very well where I pointed out to him that Peel Region had 21% of the population of Ontario, 11% of the population, but 23% of the cases of COVID because, of course, we're the manufacturing center, but 7% of the vaccine. And how is that possible when communities that have conservative representatives, rich friends and cronies, are getting vaccine, but it's not going where it's needed? And he didn't like that. He didn't like that I challenged him as mayor to, the effects of his various bills, and there's been so many of them, but I think it was 23 at the time, or maybe it was 105, on the detrimental impact and the unintended consequences that communities were facing as a result of this legislation. And as you well know, I used to have weekly town hall meetings, press conference, exactly. And, I would call it out. And so he doesn't take well to constructive criticism.
Let me, speaking of which, let me tell you two things that I hear about you all the time. You know what? I'm out there talking to people.
Yes.
The first is, I'll give you the good news first. The first is you got a lot of energy. You rev up the troops. You make Liberals feel good about being liberal again after many years
Proud
in the
to
wilderness.
be liberal again. Yep.
Okay, and they like that about you. The other thing I hear, however, is not much policy coming out of Bonnie Crombie and the Liberals yet. So can I do a bit of a checklist here and see where you are on various things?
Yep.
Okay. This current government canceled the basic income pilot that the previous Liberal government under Kathleen Wynne brought in. What would you do if you were Premier?
Well, certainly I wouldn't have canceled it. I wanted to see the results. I think it's a great idea, and I think it will save taxpayers money.
Okay. What about on the issue of taxes? Any taxes you prepared to raise?
Well, in fact, we've already announced that we're slashing small business taxes in half. And I think that's, it gets lost in all the busyness that's at Queen's Park. And the day that we announced that tax cut was the same day they announced Honda over in Barrie. So it maybe got lost in the media, but we're back at it now, and people are focused once again. I mean, the summer is a little bit of downtime for everyone, and so we're back at it. I think we're a party that has proposed. We're a party of proposition, not opposition. So if you actually look back at many of the private members' bills that Adil Shamji has proposed, or Stephanie Bowman, or frankly Stephen Blay or Andrea Hazel, they have numerous to their names. And one of them was, of course, the tax cuts.
Okay, let me do one more.
Sure.
Guys like this, when they write columns, always say, why don't you bring in congestion pricing? So that, which they did in London, England, and which deters people from driving downtown and collects money for the Treasury that you can spend on public transit and so on. Congestion pricing, is that something you'd consider?
Not at this point. I mean, we see today how ineffective the 407 has been because it's a toll road. It's under capacity and underutilized. And so I think we would see the same thing. So, I think people feel that they're already contributing to the building of roads through their taxes, and this would be a double taxation. So I don't think people would look very favorably on a congestion tax.
When the Tories won in 2018, they had a number of items on their to-do list right away of Liberal policies they wanted to reverse, whether that was cap and trade, whether that was green energy. Frankly, the list was substantial. I'm wondering if there's anything on Bonnie Crombie's to-do list on day one, a Tory policy, a current policy of the government that you would reverse on day one.
Yeah. So more for me, it's different priorities. What we saw in this budget was an effective cut to healthcare and an absolute cut to education. Those have to be reversed. I think we need increased funding to parents with autistic kids for diagnosis and treatment. I think we're on record as doubling the ODSP because those are the most vulnerable of our communities are really suffering. So for me, it's focusing on the key priorities of Ontarians. And frankly, this government came in with great promise that they were going to build housing. And let me say they have been an abject failure on building housing. They aren't meeting 50% of their targets. April was the worst building month on record.
Is that their fault, or is that interest rates, lack of labor available?
That can be done. Well, look, BC is finding a way to build. Alberta, the province of Alberta is building homes. The state of Texas is building homes. The province of Ontario hasn't figured it out. So I would say there's been an abject failure on those three fronts, and that's where I would be putting investment.
I'm interested in, given that you're a former municipal politician, you were just at AMO, Association of Municipalities of Ontario, you gave a speech. You know as well as anybody, municipalities are begging for a new deal from Queen's Park because they are
Absolutely.
paying for things that they think ought not to be paid for from a property tax base.
That's right.
Would you sit here tonight and give us a commitment that you will give a new deal to municipalities if you become the Premier of Ontario?
I am committed to giving municipalities a new deal. I said so then. I've said so previously.
What does it look like, though?
Well, you know what? It could look like a couple. There are options. So certainly we're all familiar with the Toronto Act, which gives the City of Toronto multiple choices on different taxation and revenues. Let's call them revenue streams, should they choose to use them. They've used some, they've cut back others, and they haven't used others. I think that suite of tools should be available to other municipalities, but I want to have the discussion with them. So, there has always been the discussion on the 1%, the RST. Is that a direction we want to go? Let's bring them together, because I know they have different opinions, quite frankly, and what may work in one municipality may not work in another. So do we give them the suite of tools? Do we look at a provincial-wide new tool like an RST? I want to bring them
Retail
together.
sales tax?
Well, yeah, with the 1%, right? Or the 1 cent. So I would want to consult with them, but I'm fully aware, as a former mayor of the third largest city of this province, that a new deal is required. Each and every single day, we're asked to build 21st century cities with 19th century tools, quite frankly. The downloading on the cities is enormous. We've been asked to deal with issues that aren't municipal. Cities are asked to deal with issues that are not their responsibilities. The mental health care crisis, the opioid crisis, the suicide crisis. Frankly, asylum seekers flooding the shelters. So the cost to the municipal, the cost on municipalities is great, and they're not being reimbursed those funding. In fact, I'll even throw in the healthcare contribution, the community charge when you're building a new healthcare facility, whether it be a hospital or ER clinic. The local community is responsible to contribute a percentage, I think it's 10%, when building a new facility. And this is solely a provincial responsibility, and it detracts from, the ability to further your own municipal goals and your own municipal infrastructure priorities.
Monday will be the 4th National Truth and Reconciliation Day.
Yeah.
Governments at multiple levels are still failing on some of their commitments to Indigenous people. Just over the summer, the federal Liberal Party was criticized for its lack of progress on issues of missing and murdered Indigenous women. Mm-hmm. What would the Liberals do in government to move reconciliation forward?
It's an excellent question, and we have to work more closely with Indigenous communities. And as the former mayor of the city of Mississauga, we tried to work closely with the Mississaugas of the Credit. And, we held a powwow, and we'd been talking about holding joint council meetings. So it was pretty exciting stuff. And I, for one, will
sorry,
be...
we should say, like the powwow, that's not a colloquialism. That was, you were actually...
Correct.
Yes.
Yes. I will be engaging in events to commemorate that day on Monday as well. But we need to engage with them a little more. They need to benefit, certainly from the Ring of Fire in the north when we mine their natural resources. They need to be a stakeholder. They need to share in the profits. We need to work more closely with them and be sensitive to their needs and consult with them. You'll be happy to know that we have now nominated Chief in Manitoulin Island, where I think you have a vacation property, Steve. So we're trying to engage them at the elected level as well to stand for our party and represent their communities at Queen's Park.
Speaking of nominations, are you any closer to figuring out which riding you will be running in?
Yes.
And that riding would be?
I've made no secret that I'll be running in Mississauga. I think that makes most sense for the mayor of Mississauga to run in former mayor in Mississauga, not in Belleville or Milton. At this point, I'll let him keep him guessing. So we're narrowed it down, and I'll leave you in a little more suspense for a little while longer.
I should know this, but I don't. How many ridings are there in Mississauga?
6.
There's 6.
Yeah.
So you're going to run in one of 6 ridings in Mississauga
Well, I
for
think
sure.
2 of our candidates have been nominated, haven't they?
so
in
we're down to
Mississauga?
4
We're
then.
down to 4.
1 of 4.
1 of 4.
All right. Spinning wheel, round and round.
Keeps everyone off guard a little bit.
I get you.
Keeps them on edge.
Your staff will no doubt be upset with us if we keep you longer because you've got other stuff to do. So can I just say, Bonnie Crombie, leader of the
Thank you
Ontario
so
Liberals,
much.
we're grateful you came in and joined us today here at TVO.
I got one more point. May I?
Please.
So we talked only a little bit about the convention this weekend, where we did do the rebranding, but the fact that it was a policy conference was very special for me, and the fact that we had, 22 speakers and 8 unions represented, and their leadership of 400,000 workers was pretty significant. And the caliber of speaker that we had, I think really speaks to the fact that Liberals are back. People want to be engaged. People attended in mass numbers, and people are proud to be a Liberal again. They're wearing it on their T-shirt. I love nurses. I love SIU, etc. So I love teachers.
Well, can I throw one last one in?
Absolutely,
one of those
since I
speakers
did, yeah.
was Jane Philpott,
Yes.
who has spoken openly about how she might be willing to get back into politics. Have you asked her to be a candidate for the Ontario Liberals?
Well, I never discussed that because.
The answer is probably 100 times.
But listen, wasn't she a perfect speaker to engage us on delivering of primary health? She's written the manual, and I'd love her to be a part of the implementation in whatever capacity she can be.
And if she were to run against Paul Calandra in the next election, that would just be...
You wouldn't mind that either. We'll leave that laugh as the last word here. Madam Crombie, thank you so much for joining us here
Thanks
at
for having
TVO.
me.
And with that, we're on to your column, my column. Time now for our regular feature, Your Column, My Column, in which JMM and I reminisce about the columns we wrote for TVO.org over the past week. Start us off, my friend.
Right. So if you are listening to this podcast bright and early on Friday morning, it will not be online yet, but later I should have something online about a report out this week commissioned by the Development Lobby. I want to put that out front, but and it is mostly about the high cost of building new homes in the GTA. But there is a section in it that carries a warning that the supply of new housing projects, and particularly like high-rise condos in the GTA, is drying up, and their projections suggest that by 2027 or so, functionally like 0 new big high-rise projects are coming in the pipeline. And that's extremely alarming for these developers because, of course, this is their business, and they're dealing with everything from taxes that they are, of course, complaining about perennially, but also interest rates that are not coming down fast enough to their liking, and a whole bunch of policies, federally and provincially, against things like investors buying condos. They are very concerned that, just as with interest rates coming down, just as buyers start coming back to the housing market, there will not be the supply there to meet demand. One does not have to weep for housing developers, but I think it's a very simple mathematical problem that, the population is going to continue growing. And if we don't have that new housing supply coming in the pipeline, and, in the GTA, what we're talking about here, the high-rise construction really has been the lion's share of new homes that have been built in the region. That's a huge problem, and it is one that developers are increasingly alarmed about, and I suspect that governments are going to have to come up with a solution to.
Gotcha.
And how about you, Steve?
Apropos of our conversation with Bonnie Crombie and the Liberals' annual general meeting, which took place last week in London, I decided to do a column on their new slogan. And I was very interested in what she had to say in our interview about that slogan, because my read on it as I first heard it, and the slogan is "More for You." And the chant at the convention was "Less for them, more for you. Less for them, more for you." When I heard that, to my ear, it sounded less like, well, let me pluck this out of thin air as an example. Dalton McGuinty's slogan in one of his election campaigns, I think his last one actually, 2011, was "Forward Together." That is kind of a clarion call for all of us to work together to think about what we owe each other as we build a society. I'm not making a value judgment on it. I'm just saying that's what it evokes.
Yes.
This new slogan, "More for You," sounded to me a lot more baby boomer, me, my generation, what's in it for me, what's government going to do for me?
Yes.
Not, as I indicated, sort of John F. Kennedy's ask not what your government can do for you, ask what, or your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. So I was interested to hear her answers on how she regards it. That's what my ear heard. Maybe other people heard something else. But anyway, we have the lots of time between now and the next election to figure out whether it's all about moving forward together or more for you.
I mean, who knows how much time we actually have, but we've got a few months at least.
Well, a few months, yeah, we shall see. No mailbag this week, right?
No mailbag because we've got a bit of a packed show, so we will get to questions and comments next week. If you would like to ask about content on the show, however, you can always please email us at onpolitics@tvo.org.
Great. And that is the On Poly podcast for this September 27th, 2024.
You can follow our show on Apple Podcasts so that you get notified each time a new episode is available, and you can see the video version of the podcast on the TVO Today YouTube channel.
Any feedback you have, we're happy to hear it, good, bad, or indifferent. Write us an email at onpolitics@tvo.org, and be sure to include your first and last name and where you're writing from.
This week's episode was produced and edited by Matthew O'Mara, video editing by Colin Kish.
Production support from Jonathan Hallowell and TVO's Digital Media Services team.
Our managing editor is Katie O'Connor, Lori Few is the executive producer of Digital, and John Ferry is vice president, programming and content.
Special thanks, as always, to our wonderful studio crew for setting up the space here and making it all look so good, and not only look good, but sound good. And for my shout out this week, it's to you, Tina Zavagno, audio expert, for making this pod sound great. So thanks, Tina. And until next Friday, everybody, bye-bye.
Bye-bye, everyone.